Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're happy you're here with us, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's event with Adam Higginbotham. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping notes as always. One, we have many events coming up here over the next month, including appearances from Jeff Shera, who will talk about his new novel, The Shadows of War, a novel of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And next Friday, we'll be hosting New York Times best-selling theoretical physicist Sean Carroll, who will be talking about his new book, Quanta and Fields. Please visit our website for more information, and as always, stay tuned to our social media pages, e-newsletter, and take an events flyer as you leave. Lastly, we encourage you to come away with a signed copy of Challenger tonight. We also have copies of Adam's previous book, Midnight in Chernobyl, available for purchase, and Adam will sign those as well. Adam will be sticking around afterwards for a book signing and personalization, and a quick reminder that book sales are so important for the sustainability of our event series, and every purchase helps support the author, our booksellers, and the future of our events. But at this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers. Connie Doebele spent 25 years at C-SPAN Television as a senior executive producer. She has produced the network's signature book program, Book Notes. In addition, she was the originating producer for C-SPAN's Book TV. In 2011, she produced a documentary about the Library of Congress. Connie also spent many years in front of the camera moderating C-SPAN's call-in programs and book interviews. She moved to Harrisburg last fall after 4 years at Purdue University as managing director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Of course, our featured author this evening is Adam Higginbotham. Adam has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, and Smithsonian. He's the author of Midnight in Chernobyl, which was the winner of the William E. Colby Award and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. And of course, Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. He lives with his family in New York City. Of course, the book we're here for this evening, again, is titled Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster at the edge of space. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from Jeff Dyer, who writes, quote, a masterly example of how meticulous research and adherence to factual detail can build a narrative of almost unbearable suspense. At the same time, with the outcome known from the beginning, the story has the implacable power of tragic inevitability. We're so honored to welcome Adam back to Harrisburg for the second time. So without further ado, please join me in giving Connie and Adam a warm Harrisburg welcome.
So, Adam, I would like you to begin by just explaining why you broke this book into 3 parts.
Oh, that's an excellent question that no one has asked me before. So the 3 parts, well, I think because the story unfolds over such a long period of time, there's been a lot written about the Challenger accident before. But the last time anybody really tried to do this, which is to write a narrative nonfiction account that explains everything, was back in 1987, when 2 books came out that were written by journalists who were covering it at the time. And I knew when I went back and looked at what they'd written that I needed to kind of take the story back slightly further. So the first third of the book really explains the background of what brought not only the 7 astronauts who are on Challenger to the launch pad in 1986 and their backgrounds, but also the sort of institutional and technical background of the shuttle itself and how that came to be created. And in a way, in the most important way, how that laid the seeds of the accident, because the origins of the accident really go back to 1969. And then the second part of the book is the sort of golden period of the space shuttle program, because another imperative that I felt when I first started thinking about how to tell a story was that the 2 shuttle accidents, Challenger and then Columbia in 2003, had really overshadowed the shuttle program quite understandably. But what they had overshadowed was exactly how extraordinary an achievement Space Shuttle was, and what a kind of amazing piece of engineering it was. And with that, the way in which it was perceived in the years leading up to the accident. So I was 17 when the accident happened, so I think I would have been 15 or 16 when Bruce McCandless made that kind of amazing untethered space flight in the man maneuvering unit, which was, on the front pages of newspapers around the world. And there's a whole series of these kinds of achievements that were made with the shuttle program in the years between 81, when the first one was launched, and 86, when the accident happened. And I really wanted to kind of to bring that back to life and to reacquaint people with exactly how extraordinary that was, and how people felt about it. When I first started doing the research, and I discovered that when the first shuttle flight landed in the desert in 1981, there were 250,000 people turned out in the middle of nowhere to see this thing land. And the way the shuttle is talked about in retrospect now as a sort of emblem of technological failure, that seems kind of strange and pretty amazing. So that's why the second part is as it is. And then the third part really is the entire narrative of everything that happened leading up to it starts in 1986. And that's really, it's kind of self-explanatory, I think.
So what is in this book that we didn't know before? In some way, shape, or form, through journalism, through those books in 87?
What I wanted to set out to do was to tell, firstly, the stories of each of the 7 astronauts who are on board, because previous sort of human tellings of the story have focused really very strongly on Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, quite understandably, because she was, even at the time, she was the most prominent member of the crew. But as soon as I began reading about them, I discovered that each of the other 6 members of the crew had these sort of equally remarkable stories. And some of the members of the crew had they'd been really unfairly sort of buried in history. But as well as that, the other story that hadn't been told from the inside really was of the rocket engineers who tried to stop the launch taking place in the first place. So I knew that I wanted to write about Alan McDonald and Roger Beaujolais stories specifically. But although Al McDonald who was still alive when I was researching the book, had written a very detailed memoir and had kept detailed notes at the time, Beaujolais was already long dead by the time I started the research. And it wasn't until probably 3 years into doing the research and the writing on the book that I finally got into the National Air and Space Museum archives in Virginia, which were closed for a lot of the time I was working on the first part of the book because of COVID. And when I got in there, I went there to look at the files, actually, that had been donated by Joe Trento and his wife Susan, who had written one of those 2 books I mentioned, came out in 86 or 87. And I called Joe before I even started work on anything else, because I wanted to find out if he still had transcripts of the interviews that he'd done with senior NASA officials who died years ago. And he said, "Oh, I don't, but that's because we've given them to the National Air and Space Museum. Just call them up, and you can go in." And so I did. I wrote them an email, and they said, "Yes, you can absolutely come in, but we're closing because of the pandemic next week. And when we reopen, you're more than welcome to come back." And 2 years later, I got to arrange to come in. So anyway, I phoned up I phoned up the archivist who I'd contacted in 2020. And I said, "Well, how long, Elizabeth, do you think that I'll need to come in and go through these boxes of transcripts?" She said, "There's only 3 cartons. 2 days you do it. There's not much here." So I went in, I did exactly that, and she was exactly right. It took me like half a day to go through these just handful of dot matrix printed sheets. This is how old the stuff was, of this handful of like 10 or 12 transcripts. But bearing in mind the Robert Caro thing of turn every page, I was like, well, I wonder what else is in these boxes. So I went through every other document in the boxes and eventually came to an envelope that just had a completely unmarked CD in it, right? So I thought, well, I wonder this stuff's like 30 years old, so obviously there's not going to be anything on this that's readable. But I said to the archivist, "I'm going to lunch. Would you mind," I realize this is probably a fool's errand, "but would you mind taking a look at this and see if it's readable anyway?" Went off, got myself a sandwich in the museum shop, Came back half an hour later. I said, "With any luck with the?" That's it. And no luck, I suppose, with the CD. She said, "Oh no, it's up on that computer over there at the end of the room." So I went to the end of the room, and not only was it readable, but it contained the full version of a 600-page memoir that Roger Beaujolais had written before he died and never published. So all of that material told his story from the inside.
Your use of detail, I have to tell you, is amazing. You're already. Have you read it? Oh, Chernobyl. Okay, so this is like the level of detail is absolutely amazing. Sometimes I would look at a sentence and I would think to myself, it took him a day to find this. How does he, so what's your process? Why all the detail, and why does it make a difference in the story?
Because I'm setting out to write something that has the, and I'm glad that you think it works, to be honest, thank you. So I'm setting out to write something that has the immediacy of a novel, and I can't write fiction. I mean, I've never tried, but it seems almost impossible. I can't imagine how you do it. But the one part of the technique that I understand is that you need to create a sense of place and a sense of personality, and in order to do that, you need those kind of details. And so you have to choose them pretty carefully, obviously. But in order to make a scene seem vivid and real, you've got to have that level of detail. So that's why, if you have a draft document where Roger Beaujolais is describing how he feels the minute that he realizes that he's in this room where they're going to turn a recommendation not to launch, his recommendation not to launch, into a recommendation to launch, then then that's really important. This kind of visceral feeling that he has when he realizes, and you can put that in. That's great. And equally, as I did with the Chernobyl book, I made sure that I got access to all of the key locations that the action takes place in, so that you can describe, how the shadows on the roof of the Launch Control Center look, or the way turkey buzzards float in the thermals going up the outside of the vehicle assembly building. And so I'm going to harvest this stuff as effectively as I can. And when you're interviewing people as well, if they recall direct speech, especially if you can corroborate it elsewhere, then that's also really important.
But sometimes it was even just the temperature of the room that the meeting was being held in. That
Right,
was part of the narrative.
Yes, and that kind of, I remember that specifically because when the fact checker was going through it, he said, "You said here the room was hot. How do you know that?" And it's like, well, if you read the transcript, William Rogers says on the fourth page of those meetings, of the transcripts, he says it's hot in here. We've got to see if we can turn up the air conditioning. So it's like, okay, well, we can, I think we can use that. And it was the fact checker was like, oh yeah, no, I see that now.
So the sense of place, it also happens for the reader. I don't know if you know that, but in cases like the Challenger and the number of people who raised their hand that they remembered, in reading your book, I went back. I knew exactly where I was when the Challenger accident, because I was working for C-SPAN at the time. And I thought, what did we do? How did we cover that? I don't even remember. And so this afternoon, I opened up the C-SPAN archives, and I went back to 1986, and I played the video of some of the 12 hours of open phones. You know how C-SPAN opens the phones and just lets people talk about what they say? Well, that's what C-SPAN did that day.
Wow, really?
And I watched Brian Lamb do, for 3 hours, ask viewers, what did you see? How do you feel about this? And so I want to tell you about a couple of what they said and see if it reflected what was really going on at the time. First couple people said, defund NASA.
Really?
Yeah. Then the next person said, don't defund NASA. Third person said it was sabotage. I swear it was sabotage. Another person said, we have to make sure that the press doesn't make NASA look too bad. Was that part of the narrative that was going along?
It absolutely was,
Yeah.
because there's a whole FBI file on their investigation into the possibility of sabotage. Because when at the same time these people were phoning into C-SPAN, possibly the same people were phoning the FBI to report that, their brother had said that they'd seen somebody, suspicious on the perimeter, by the perimeter fence at the Cape, and, they felt sure that it was a missile. And, because you've got to remember that this is also well, I'm sure you do, I don't need to tell you this, but this was the era of like Colonel Gaddafi, Libyan terrorism, So that was definitely a thing. And one of the interesting aspects of it in terms of public opinion is that maybe counterintuitively, I mean, certainly now in the way that, society is kind of so divided and partisan, it's hard to remember that this was a time when really the nation kind of came together in the wake of the accident and thought about this thing in a single way. But support for NASA in the wake of the accident increased, and people's support for the space program, the shuttle, increased in the wake of the accident.
Well, and so later that day, as I was looking through the video, I actually saw me interviewing Congressman Joe Barton, who happened, a Republican of Texas, who was on the science committee. And it was interesting, here he had been in Congress 1 year. He was on the science committee, and he was being a NASA cheerleader that day. He was not going to, so we'll question it and everything, but, NASA's okay. They're good guys.
Right. And that's pretty much what William Rogers said when he was initially appointed to head the inquiry. He said that, we think, and I think the American people think, that NASA is doing an excellent job.
Why would he say that when he knew he was going to be heading an investigation like that? Did he really not care that people wanted a solid investigation, or did they not want a solid investigation?
I don't think that he was suggesting that there wouldn't be a solid investigation. I think that he took NASA at their word in the immediate aftermath of the accident, because the way that it worked was that they began conducting an internal investigation, which was exactly what, and this is another reason that the book is structured as it is, because it starts with the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, which was the first real disaster that NASA experienced on this kind of scale, and that people have largely forgotten because it was eclipsed by the successes of the subsequent Apollo flights to the moon. But on that occasion, the then administrator of NASA went to visit President Johnson personally and secured on a handshake deal. He went into Johnson's bedroom, and Johnson was in his pajamas. And the administrator did this handshake deal. He said, I don't think we need an external inquiry into this, do we? And Johnson just said, oh, no, you can do it yourselves. That'll be fine. And there are ways in which that was a genuine cover-up. And so with Challenger, they were initially permitted to do that. But Reagan's chief of staff, Donald Reagan, who I did go back and try and figure out the timeline of this, because he said essentially to Reagan, we can't afford the appearance of a cover-up in this. We need to have an external inquiry, partly because the political climate and the media climate had changed so much. This is post-Watergate. So people were on the lookout for government malfeasance, and NASA did not have the same kind of public support or support in Congress, or the unquestioning support they'd had at the time of the Apollo program. And so I think Reagan recognized that Donald Reagan recognized that this was just not the same environment. But also, I think that he also knew that they were up to their elbows in Iran-Contra, and they couldn't afford an extra scandal when Iran-Contra would come out. I mean, it hadn't at this point, but he knew what was going on.
It was interesting also in these callers that a lot of them were bringing up Graham-Rudman, which I hadn't thought of in a long time, which was the budget cutting that was expected to be coming down the pike in there in terms of that. I want to ask you just a couple of tidbits that I had never heard before. One is how the families were treated after the explosion.
What would you like to know about that?
Well, I think it's a story that I don't think a lot of people know about how they were treated and how they were locked away and weren't really giving a whole lot of information.
Well, they were. I mean, they were really sequestered by NASA for good reason, which is that this became, the biggest news story in the world as soon as it happened, and they were really hounded by the media. And they, NASA did their best to put security guards and stuff on the doors of their houses and tried to keep people away. But, they had camera crews camping out on their lawns, which would be bad enough if the camera crews were doing what they did during the moon missions, which was like keeping watch on the wives while their heroic husbands were flying to the moon. But, this was taking place in the wake of this terrible tragedy that they had witnessed in real time. So, I mean, I just can't, it's almost unimaginable that the pressure and the misery that would have resulted in for them.
Did they talk to you? Did any family members talk to you?
Yeah. But they certainly weren't kept in the dark about, they weren't deliberately kept in the dark, because each family was assigned a casualty assistance officer, which is what they would do in the Navy or the Air Force. For someone who's lost their husband or their wife, you're assigned someone who is your intermediary with the outside world and brings you all of the information about crash investigation, funerals. They look after getting you from place to place. So those people would be a conduit of all of that information. What they didn't know, in many cases by choice, for instance, June Scobie, who the widow of the commander of the flight, Dick Scobie, she told me that she didn't know anything about what the Rogers Commission uncovered about the cause of the accident, about the proximate cause of the accident being the failure of these O-rings and the solid rockets. And all of the conversations leading up to the accident where these engineers tried to have the launch called off and then they had this recommendation reversed. She didn't know about any of that until the investigation was finished and they were presented with a draft version of the report before it was published. And that's the first she heard of it, because she couldn't bear to watch television or read the newspapers. So she only knew what was coming to her directly from NASA, and they weren't telling her that stuff.
Lock the door. A quote from your book. I thought that was fascinating. Tell the story.
So that's the instruction that's given in mission control in a contingency like a catastrophe of this scale, which is that they want to preserve, for the purposes of further investigation, all of the data that exists in the form it remains in at the moment of the accident. And so they have at NASA, they have these protocols where everybody in mission control, so there were 12 people on consoles during the course of the launch, they would have to preserve all of their notes, all of their printouts from their consoles. The telephones are disconnected, so nobody can call in or out and provide any information or provide information that's going out of the room. And they do physically lock the doors so that nobody can come in or out.
Is there anybody who didn't cooperate with you?
There were plenty of people. I mean, just as there were with the Chernobyl book. I mean, me and the fixers that I worked with in Ukraine and in Russia, we probably sent twice as many requests to people as we actually sat down with to interview. And I requested interviews with plenty of people for this book who didn't talk to me. Whether they, what their motivation was, I don't know. I mean, one retired astronaut asked me to pay him to talk to him.
That's a very British thing, isn't it? I recall trying
Home of checkbook journalism, is
Yeah.
that what you're saying?
I remember trying to book British journalists in the 1980s, and they would say, yes, £50, please.
Wow. Yes. Well, I guess that is a very British thing. But no, I mean, I didn't get anybody. I don't think I particularly upset anyone by asking them to talk to me. But the guy that asked to be paid is the only one that really sticks in my mind. But I did speak to, I spoke to friends or family of each member of the crew. And I spent more time talking to some than to others. But the family of Mike Smith, who was the pilot,
Mhm.
um, were especially kind of generous with their time and understood, I think, very clearly what I had in mind and what sort of book I wanted to write. And that sort of encouraged them to trust me, that I wasn't going to write some sort of exploitative or ghoulish version of the story.
There are two names in here that even I, as a journalist, had never heard before, and of course they're very important. ArieAldrich and Jesse Moore.
Right.
Who are they?
Well, so Jesse Moore was the overall head of the shuttle program, and Arnie Aldrich was the senior manager from the Johnson Space Center, who were two of the men who had to give the final sign-off for launch on the day of the accident.
Are they still alive? Did you talk to them?
Arnie Aldrich died actually quite relatively recently. I think that he may have died in 2020. I can't remember. But Jesse Moore's still around. But I can't remember. I did have Jesse Moore's email address, and I can't remember. I think that I reached out to him. I just never heard back. But to be honest, I can't remember because there was, as you'll appreciate, there was a very, very long list of people that that I needed to talk to for this.
So how NASA handled the aftermath of the accident is an interesting portion of it, and specifically how there was a whole new team of journalists who had never covered NASA before, who all at once wanted to step in and be NASA experts, space experts. Talk about that.
Well, so I mean, the way in which, and I think this still sort of lingers in the public imagination a little bit about Challenger, is the way that it was perceived in the weeks immediately after the accident, and then once the Rogers Commission report came out, was that NASA had engaged in sort of deliberate attempts to cover up what happened.
Did they? Was it by not talking at all?
It was because I think that they first of all, it's partly what you say, they misread they didn't read the room, because the last time they had suffered a tragedy like this, it was during the moon program in 67. And the nation and the media were right behind them in everything that they wanted to do. And nobody was going to ask, I mean, people did ask some tough questions, but they weren't really going to try to tear the agency apart in a way that the post-Watergate press corps was primed to do. And that was combined with the fact that that NASA really mishandled the public messaging about the accident from the instant it happened. They had in no way institutionally prepared for a catastrophe of this scale.
Isn't that surprising? Or not?
Well, it was partly, I imagine that part of it is that they didn't feel it was necessary. There was a lot of hubris involved in this accident. And I think that there's some ways in which they didn't think that anything like this could ever happen. But also it was a sort of function of the fact that by 1986 the agency was across the board trying to do too much with too little. So they had engineers and technicians on the ground who were working around the clock constantly to try and prepare these 4 shuttles for launch on this extremely ambitious launch schedule. And the system was already kind of coming apart before Challenger launched, just in the kind of rush to try and get these things off the ground on schedule. And at the same time, that affected everybody who worked at the agency. So they had prepared a contingency plan for something like this to happen live on television in real time and how to deal with it. And the Public Affairs Department had worked this through, but they hadn't had any time to rehearse it because they'd been too busy handling public affairs requests for these launches that were constantly taking off and cycling through the Cape. And then the guy who was the head of public affairs, who had overseen this whole plan, left to go for a job at the post office. like 2 months before, I think 2 months before the accident. And there was all this instability and turnover at the top of the agency. The administrator of James Beggs, who was the head of NASA, had been indicted for what turned out to be completely trumped up fraud charges in November of 1985. And so they put his recently appointed deputy, who was this guy who'd been on the job for a couple of weeks, they made him the administrator of NASA. So at the top of the organization, it was just in complete disarray, and then the accident happened. And so the way that they tried to keep the public informed in the wake of the accident was governed as much by a sort of rigid insistence on adhering to these kind of strict engineering protocols. They would say, we can't talk about what we think might have caused the accident until we work through all of these fault trees that we've developed for figuring out exactly what happened. And because they wouldn't say anything while everybody around knew that they were conducting beginnings of an investigation, and as it turned out, within days, they got a pretty good idea what had happened. But they wouldn't publicly say because it didn't match their protocols. That, initially, right from the start, made it look as if they were trying to cover up what they knew. But I think that, the story is sort of full of these things that at the time were quite often characterized as deliberate malfeasance or deliberate attempts to cover up. But they were just sort of unfortunate, misinterpretations or mishandling that were then interpreted by a kind of a pretty aggressive media and Congress.
How long did it take you to write this and research it?
This one was just 4 years.
Just 4 years.
It seemed to go very quickly. I mean, because the Chernobyl book, because I had worked on the subject for a long time in reporting magazine features before I started work on the book. So from beginning to end of the research process, that was 10 years. So with this, 4 years seemed like I was kind of rushing it.
Are there any members of the astronauts' family that you got close to or that you keep in touch with?
Well, I'm still in touch with all of them because I just sent them copies of the book because I didn't.
Have they reacted yet?
Not yet. I mean, it was the finished books arrived so close to publication that I got a carton of them Thursday, less than a week ago. And so I started getting a trickle of messages earlier this week saying, we've got the book. Thank you.
So where is Alex? It's time to start with the Q&A. Did we miss him?
Where is he?
Where'd he go? It's time, Alex. We got to leave. Okay. Well, look, then I'll just take care of it. There he is. We're ready for Q&A, Alex.
Oh, is this the time, Alex?
This is the time.
Okay.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll come around with a mic. Who wants to start us off? Yes.
I'm just curious your insight. We care about this deeply, right? We cared about it in 1986 deeply. We still do care about very deeply, and it's a tragedy. You could also argue that, like, compared to Chernobyl, which could have wiped out Europe and, that mass death, it's a much smaller tragedy, but yet we feel it so big. So I feel like this story must be about something bigger to us as Americans, as people of our generation, as people why do we care so deeply much about this particular tragedy?
I think that it was because of the circumstances and the way in the degree to which something like this was unprecedented. You only have to look at what happened in 2003 with the Columbia accident, which is that actually the lawyer who did the legal read on this book, when she phoned me up to talk through things that she needed to discuss with me, the first thing she said was, I'd completely forgotten about the Columbia accident. I got to the end of the book, I couldn't believe I'd forgotten about that. But I think there's a good reason for that, which is that it's hard to conceive of now, given everything that's happened in the last 40 years. But nothing like this had ever happened live on television in front of the nation before. And it was such a shock, and it was such a shattering moment in not only people's conception of the way they thought about the future and about high technology, but about the nation. Because it was, Reagan, I think, particularly, had worked very adroitly to make the space shuttle a kind of a symbol of a resurgent America. And if you, I mean, I don't know how old you are, but if, right, but if you think back of the way in which, and again, I find it kind of hard to remember, but if you think back of the way the shuttle was represented in the media and you would see it in popular culture before the accident, it was always emblematic of high technology, of the future, of America leading the world in scientific discovery. And it was everywhere. You know, the shuttle was kind of, it meant something. It was symbolic of something. But then by 2003, we'd already had this tragedy take place. And the reason that people don't remember it in the same way is it also came 2 years after 9/11. So, you know, the way in which we experience tragedy through the media, I think, you know, was permanently changed by this event, in a way that even 9/11 didn't change that perception of the world. It was a real kind of shattering of confidence, I think.
Question over here.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, not at all.
I have a question related to the families, and I'm wondering what their reaction was, or if they took any action when they realized that there were high-level individuals that didn't want it to lift off, launch.
Some of them were very angry. And a couple of them brought lawsuits against NASA and against those specific individuals, not the ones who had recommended against launch, but those who were perceived to have acted to reverse that recommendation or ignored it and pressed on anyway. The suits against, well, to get back up a bit, once the Rogers Commission investigation was completed and the report was published, and Rogers and Neil Armstrong, who was on his commission, went before Congress to testify about their findings, there were several members of Congress who insisted that criminal negligence proceedings should be brought against those people. But Rogers, who was a former and possibly still current prosecutor, had just said that there was not enough evidence to bring that kind of case to prove criminal negligence against them. And I don't think that, you know, that ever came to anything. And there were several lawsuits that were brought by various people involved in what happened. The rocket contractors who actually built the solid rockets that were responsible, they had to make a pretty significant payout to the families. But there was no criminal negligence suits brought against individuals, or not successfully anyway.
Just curious, since both of your books are very heavy into science, the power plants and now NASA, do you have a background in science, or is it more the story around the science? And what's your next scientific story going to be, if it's going to be science?
I have the opposite of a scientific background. My middle school physics teacher would be absolutely aghast to learn that I had the temerity to write a book which centers on nuclear fission. I was absolutely hopeless at it and couldn't wait to stop studying science. But I am interested in it. And mercifully, there are a lot of very cooperative scientists out there who are wonderful interview subjects, because you can ask them a question and there's many of them, there is nothing they like more than explaining in intricate detail exactly how something works. And the real challenge in writing about things like this, and indeed nuclear fission, is to make it, is firstly for me to be able to understand it, to the degree that then I can explain it for a general reader. And then I can get it past an expert in a way that they don't deem to be absolutely ruinously oversimplified.
And you had those people, right?
Yes, with the Chernobyl book, Frank von Hippel, who's a professor at Princeton, I had a kind of hilarious, kind of quite long-running email exchange over a number of weeks where I was trying to explain how an RBMK nuclear reactor worked using information that I'd read about and that he'd explained to me. And I kept sending him stuff, and he'd say, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. No, you got to rewrite this. This is wrong. And in the end, I just said, well, you know, Frank, do you mind? Maybe you just write this paragraph for me, and then then we can be sure it's right, and I can have a look at it. And so he did that, and then he sent it back to me, and I was just like, man, this is just totally unreadable. Nobody's ever going to get through this. But I had the starting point, you know, so I knew it was correct. And so then I just kind of began simplifying it. And I worked on it for about a week, and then I sent it back to Frank. And I said, Frank, what do you think of this? Long pause. A couple of days go by, and then I get a message back saying, Adam, this is horribly oversimplified. Horribly oversimplified. And I wrote back, I said, well, yes, Frank, it may be oversimplified, but is it wrong? Rather grudgingly, no, it's not wrong. And I did the same thing with this, where I had one of the rocket engineers who'd actually worked on the program and was in the room during the teleconference when they recommended against launch, Brian Russell. He reviewed all of the technical stuff about the rockets themselves. And so I went back and forth with him a bit and so he really helped me with that, which is not to say that there are not mistakes in it. I'm sure there is somewhere. But yes, that's how I did it. I'm just thinking about this right now. The idea of I found this quite hard to do, this book, for a lot of reasons, but I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do next yet.
First, thanks for coming out tonight, spending some time talking about your book.
Not at all. Thank you for coming.
You mentioned NASA being overcommitted with the launch schedule and kind of the plans for what they were doing moving forward. There were plans to launch the shuttle out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in October of '86. And I'm wondering if in your research you found that those additional polar orbit launches created a schedule that created challenges that ultimately impacted the accident.
That I do not know. I don't know how far advanced those plans were. The launch schedule that they had for doing the launches from Cape Canaveral alone planned for 15 launches in total in 1986. It was going to be the busiest year in NASA history. I can't remember the number of launches that they'd done in '85, which was the previous busiest year. But they had done back-to-back launches in the same month in 1985. And I don't think there was more than 10 in that year. But even that meant that the system was sort of buckling under the strain. So even without whatever they were planning with the military launches from Vandenberg, the 15 launches that they had planned from Florida, were almost impossible.
Thank you for being here. I was a senior in high school in German class when the Challenger exploded. That's where I was. I wanted to ask a question, and I think some of the conversation around the space shuttle program and how commonplace those launches became, they weren't even televised anymore. We were so used to, this was just how things were. The addition of Krista McAuliffe and the first teacher, the first civilian in space, was significant because it put a lot of us, students, kids, watching that launch in a way that we wouldn't have done had it been just astronauts who were trained to do that. Was there anything in your research about the decision to choose a teacher as the representative for us as a human race, as people? I think that's always been significant to me, because I think now when I think about it, in that situation, that was the first time I ever saw grown men cry. When that happened, and there were teachers that literally were crying, that were trying to hide that from us as students. And to me, I think back on that as just a very human reaction to what happened. So I don't know if the decision around sending a teacher as opposed to an accountant, or whomever, because now, if you have $1 billion, you can go to space, you can
Right.
build your own rocket.
Right.
So things have changed. But
Accountants then were not at the top of the list, I can tell you that. It was a very conscious decision to choose a teacher because, within NASA, they had this whole study group that was dedicated to developing the principles for what they called the Space Flight Participant Program, because this was part of a whole planned scheme that was going to send first a teacher and then a journalist, and then they were going to send an artist. But before all of this was figured out, they spent quite a long time thinking about who those people from regular walks of life would be. And James Beggs, the administrator in particular, reasoned that they needed to get, this was driven by this need to get the public engaged with the space program. As you say, they'd pre-advertised the space shuttle as a vehicle that was going to make spaceflight routine, and it succeeded in that all too effectively. It became so routine that people got bored of it, and like you say, by the time Challenger was launched, the 3 national networks weren't covering the launches live anymore. The only one that was covering it was CNN, which had only recently started. So they thought that the best way of engaging as many people as possible and to get active public participation in the program was to engage children. And so they thought, well, if we can get an educator as a spaceflight participant, then that will involve a huge number of kids really re-engage enthusiasm with the space program. And that's the best kind of person that we could choose. And it didn't hurt that Reagan also announced this in an election year in 1984, and he it helped to get teaching unions on his side. But they considered all sorts of crazy ideas. The craziest one of which, definitely, that they really seriously pursued, was to make the first space flight participant Big Bird from Sesame Street. Carol Spinney, who was the puppeteer who played Big Bird on Sesame Street, was going to go up in the costume on the space shuttle. And they corresponded with him, and he agreed to do this. And only the technical limitations of making the costume work in space prevented them from going ahead with it.
I loved your detail about Walter Cronkite wanting to be the first journalist in space, to the point where he put on an outfit. He put on a spacesuit with a helmet and everything, and went traipsing down the main street in Martha's Vineyard for a photo shoot for I think it was Life magazine. I can't remember which magazine it was. I don't want to get it wrong. But yeah, he was highly likely to be the first candidate. And an interesting thing about the Journalist in Space program is that selection continued even after Challenger happened. Because I assumed when I first started reading about this, as soon as that happened, that would have been completely cut off. But no, not only did it carry on, but many journalists were still vying for that position on this flight that was supposed to take place in September of '86.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Anyone? Yes.
With all your knowledge and the research and everything that you know now, do you feel confident about NASA in the new space, the plans they have, and how they're going about launching again?
I don't really feel that I'm equipped to answer that question with any degree of expertise. What I do know is that NASA reformed itself in response to findings of the Rogers Commission, and they overhauled their safety standards. That almost everyone who was involved in that launch decision to launch Challenger was either dismissed or moved to different positions. They placed astronauts in senior decision-making positions in the launch decision chain after that. But still, in 2003, the Columbia accident happened for almost exactly the same reasons under very similar circumstances. And it wasn't until after that happened that NASA created this internal program called the Apollo Challenger Columbia Lessons Learned program, which is run by a guy named Mike Ginelli, who now goes around NASA installations and to companies in private industry around the country, lecturing on the lessons learned from those 3 accidents, in order to try and keep that institutional memory alive in a way that they failed to between Challenger and Columbia. So I think that, after the second accident, they were aware of the fact that even though you can tell people about this stuff, if the people who learned those lessons the hard way at the time the accidents took place, retire and leave the organization, then you're still going to lose that institutional memory. So now they do work very consciously and very hard to keep the institutional lessons of those accidents alive. So I think that there is even though we're now, 20 years down the line from the last one of these accidents, I think there's a much greater awareness of needing to make sure that you look out for those kinds of problems than there was in 2003.
When you read this book, what was interesting to me is that you're not reading history. You're reading it as it happens, which I think was the same with your Chernobyl book to some degree. Is that true?
Right.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that as I was reading this book this weekend, I realized that my stomach had knotted up when I got to chapters 23 and 24, which are the day of the accident, and I kind of stopped and said to myself, I know how this ends. And so my question to you about that is, did you have any kind of emotional response in writing this as those of us who are going to have reading it?
I definitely did, in a way that I didn't with the Chernobyl book, and I think that that's maybe partly because I lived through this accident in a way that, because it was secret and I wasn't aware of the fact that it was going on, I didn't with the Chernobyl accident. But I did, and I only realized this in retrospect. But it took me. I wrote most of the book in chronological order, and I realized it took me quite a long time to get around to starting to write those 2 chapters that you're describing, because by that time I'd got to know the family of Mike Smith particularly quite well, and I learned so much about his life and about their lives as a family that I didn't want to reach the part in the narrative where that they would die. So I did find that I found that quite hard to write. Yeah.
One last question. Let's do it.
Did you learn, and perhaps does the book address the communication that was going on between NASA and the astronauts when they knew that there was no survival?
There was no communication after that moment because communication was just immediately cut off. They lost all telemetry at the moment because the shuttle did not. They had no warning of what was going to happen inside the cockpit, nor did they have any warning of what was going to happen from the data that they were receiving in mission control, which is why there's that kind of. In retrospect, it seems like such a peculiar moment where there's a few seconds of dead air, and the commentator for Mission Control, Steve Nesbitt, says, infamously, obviously a major malfunction. It was because they had no idea what had happened. And the astronauts, I mean, you'll see if you read the book, there is an indication that they suspected that something had gone wrong right at the very last second. But there was no time for any communication.
There was one detail in your book of the person who helped Krista McAuliffe put her helmet down.
Yes.
Do you remember?
Yes. Well, it
was a little earlier, but
there's the person you're talking about is Sonny Carter, who himself was subsequently killed in a plane crash, who was on each closeout crew, which is the group of technicians who, helped the astronauts into their outfits and their equipment to prepare them for launch. Includes an astronaut who is the astronaut support person who goes into the cockpit with them and then connects all their communication equipment and their oxygen lines and then makes sure their helmets are fitted properly. And in this case, it was this guy, Sonny Carter, who was a beloved member of the astronaut corps. And he told another person who I interviewed that as he made sure that Kristen McAuliffe's helmet was fitted correctly and checked that her visor was in place, he looked into her face. And right up until this moment, she had been a sort of buoyant Girl Scout type, this ebullient, constantly enthusiastic individual. But Sonny Carter reported to this guy, John Devlin, afterwards that he looked into her face at that moment and all of that had gone and she just looked terrified.
That's the kind of detail you're going to get in this book. Alex?
Yeah, we have to wrap up, but can we give one more round of applause for Adam Higginbotham? Thank you so much, Connie. Thank you, Adam. I don't know if we plugged this, but this is the first official event. Publication date isn't even until next week, so you can't get this book anywhere until next Tuesday. So we're going to have a book signing over at this table here. Book sale, or books are available for purchase up at the cafe. We have Challenger and also Midnight in Chernobyl. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Have a good night.